Hello and welcome to this brief interview from the CARICOM secretariat. My name is Salas Hamilton and I'm the Specialist Communications. Today I'm speaking with my colleague, Dr. Chantal Ononaiwu, the Trade Policy and Legal Specialist in the CARICOM Single Market and Trade Directorate. We are both based here in Barbados and we'll be having a little chat about the 12th World Trade Organization, WTO Ministerial Conference, MC12, which was held earlier in June 2022 at the WTO headquarters in Geneva. The Ministerial Conference, the WTO's highest decision making body, had last met in 2017. Originally scheduled for June 2020, MC12 had been postponed twice due to the COVID 19 pandemic and took place against the backdrop of armed conflict between two key members, Russia and Ukraine. Welcome, Chantal.
Thank you, Salas, for having me. I'm really pleased to be joining you for this chat.
No problem. I have given a brief background to MC12. Is there anything you wish to add, of course, including why there was so much importance attached to it?
Yes, Salas. The World Trade Organization is a multilateral organization. It sets trade rules and it settles trade disputes for its 164 members. And the Ministerial Conference, which is made up of trade ministers of WTO members, it's a top decision-making body of the organization. It typically meets every 2 years. And so as you had pointed out, not having met for 5 years, it was really critical that the 12th Ministerial Conference, MC12, take place. And as you rightfully noted, the ministerial really took place in the context of multiple crises, or as the WTO Director General calls them, polycrises, including, as you've mentioned, in addition to the conflict, in addition to the crises that you mentioned, of course, we were also facing or continue to face rising fuel and food prices. We continue to face a climate crisis. And so it was really important to demonstrate that the WTO could respond to pressing global challenges like pandemics and food insecurity. And it was really important to demonstrate that multilateral cooperation could prevail in the face of crisis. Now, additionally, I just want to point out that the WTO itself has been facing challenges. Its negotiating pillar has stagnated. Since the WTO was established in 1995, WTO members have concluded few multilateral trade agreements. And so the rulebook of the WTO really needs updating so that it can respond to modern realities and address new issues. Even the dispute settlement mechanism of the organization has not been functioning properly. Its appellate body hasn't been able to hear appeals since 2020 because there's been a persistent blockage to the appointment of new judges. So it was really critical to have a ministerial conference that could deliver meaningful outcomes and thereby demonstrate that the WTO continued to be relevant as a multilateral institution. So all of these factors, I think, contributed to why it was so important to have MC12 take place when it did.
Did I miss it? What you mentioned about the negotiating pillar having been stagnating. I was going to ask you, what is this pillar?
Yes, so one of the core functions of the WTO is to actually develop multilateral trade rules. And this is done through negotiations among its, well, now 164 members. Now, of course, those negotiations are quite difficult. Achieving consensus among such a large and diverse body of members is quite difficult. But really, the ability of the WTO to deliver on this mandate, this negotiating mandate, had really been stymied for some time for a number of reasons. As I mentioned, since the organization was established in 1995, very few multilateral trade agreements had been concluded. the most recent one being the Trade Facilitation Agreement that was concluded in 2013. And, you can imagine that since 1995, so many developments have arisen, so many global challenges have arisen to which the organization has been called upon to respond. And so that really is what I meant by referring to the stagnation in the negotiating pillar of the organization.
Okay, got you. Chantal, we hear about our participation as a community in this conference. And the question that comes to mind is what did CARICOM hope to secure from the ministerial conference?
Well, just to take a step back, Salas, 13 of the 15 members of CARICOM are members of the WTO. And as small economies, we attach significant value to a rules-based multilateral trading system that operates under the WTO. And by rules-based, what a rules-based system actually allows us as small economies to participate in this arena on an equal footing as members. And we viewed MC12 as an opportunity to positively re-engage. As you've mentioned, the Ministerial Conference hadn't met in close to 5 years and address some of the world's biggest challenges. And so our members really wanted to contribute meaningfully to a positive outcome at the conference, to a ministerial conference that delivered substantive outcomes that addressed the interests of all members. Now, having set that context, there were specific outcomes that we wanted to secure, and I'll mention a few. We were keen to see ministers adopt a decision on the work program on small economies. As you can imagine, small, vulnerable economies like ours, we face unique challenges in participating in the world trade economy. We have constraints of small size, limited resources, lack of economies of scale. As you know, we are heavily susceptible to natural disasters. And dating back to 2001, the WTO had established a work program that would facilitate responses being developed to the trade-related issues that would really need to be addressed for economies like ours to participate meaningfully in the multilateral trading system. And so we supported a small economies program that would allow small, vulnerable economies like ours to continue to seek the requisite flexibilities in the WTO and to ensure that our trade-related concerns could be addressed. In addition, we were very keen to see the conclusion of an agreement on fisheries subsidies. This is an agreement that would have placed constraints on the ability of WTO members to provide harmful subsidies that would really lead to the depletion of global fish stocks. Believe it or not, this agreement had really been under negotiation for over 20 years. And this fisheries subsidies agreement was an important deliverable under the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. That is an agreement that would prohibit harmful fish subsidies. So we were very committed to the conclusion of an agreement of this nature at the Ministerial Conference.
When you said, one second, Chantal, when you said it's been there for 20 years,
yes,
I'm just thinking about the frustration.
Yes. And that thought is quite apt. But it is an illustration of how difficult it can be to attain consensus amongst such a diverse group of members. As you can imagine, over 20 years, the issues at play would have been thoroughly ventilated. And so it really was felt that this ministerial conference was really the one at which some kind of outcome needed to be delivered. The issues were fully understood. It was really about, was there political will to deliver on an outcome? And we were very much committed to that. We felt that a fisheries subsidies agreement would support the sustainability of our fish stocks. It would support the livelihoods of our food and livelihoods of our people. And we felt as well that it would contribute to the development of our blue economies. And so we were very keen to see this agreement delivered, but it was important for us that the agreement would recognize that as small economies, we are not the major contributors to the problem. And so we were very keen to ensure that any solution to the problem of overcapacity and overfishing would recognize the need for small economies like ours to continue to give support to our fisher folk and to the development of our blue economies. But
I
there were
have
other, oh, yes, Alice.
I have to apologize because when we were speaking about how long this interview would go, I had cheekily said 10 minutes, and I've only asked one question, and I'm
Please.
about to ask if there are other elements. I think you're about to segue into that came out of the ministerial. So I
Yes.
apologize for cheekily saying that this would have lasted 10 minutes. Yeah, tell me some of the other things that came out of it.
Yeah, no, so those were just two areas, and there are some other outcomes that we wanted to secure. We all clearly have, been through the rigor of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the WTO felt that it was important as a multilateral organization that it was able to provide a response to the current pandemic, and that it would also be positioned to be prepared to provide a response to future pandemics. And so we were committed as well to contributing to responses to the current pandemic and future pandemics that would, amongst other things, ensure that our countries would have timely and equitable access to the supplies that we needed, whether it was medical supplies or otherwise. So contributing to this response to the pandemic was also another important outcome we wanted to secure.
And was that agreed to?
Yes, it was. It was. And I don't know if you want me to get into know what the outcomes were, but we were pleased to
really
see that.
not really nitty gritty, but
Yes.
I know sometimes we go and we are represented at these international fora, and you ask what are the specific things that you can come back to the community and say were achieved. And what is in recent memory is the unfair balance in terms of that response. And that is why I'm ticking that one in terms of the pandemic response, that it
Yes.
is a real meaning for
Yes.
every citizen in CARICOM.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you want me to talk about it now, but in all of these areas that I've mentioned so far, in which we wanted to secure responses, I'm pleased to say that the ministerial conference did deliver responses, and the pandemic response was one. Two other areas I just quickly mentioned where we wanted to see outcomes, and it gives you a sense of the breadth of subjects that were really covered at this ministerial conference. There was the opportunity to set a future work program for agriculture negotiations, which has proven to be a very difficult subject on which to secure outcomes. We wanted to ensure that in any future work program that was set for negotiations in this critical area, that our countries could safeguard certain flexibilities that would really allow us to provide our farmers with the space to grow their own incomes and supply markets as well. We know that we are in the middle of a food crisis brought on in part by the war in Ukraine. And we wanted to also see a positive outcome on food security at MC12. We are net food importing countries, even though there are initiatives underway to boost agricultural production in the region. The reality is we're net food importing developing countries. And so we wanted outcomes that would ensure that WTO members would be restrained in their imposition of restrictions on exports of food items, even items that are purchased, food items that are purchased for humanitarian purposes by the World Food Programme. That was an important outcome that we wanted to see. The last one I would mention, there were many, but the last one I would mention is we wanted to see WTO ministers set forth a path for a future work program on reform of the organization. I would have mentioned earlier certain elements of the functioning of the organization that are really not optimal. And so there has been a lot of talk of WTO reform, but not with a lot of clarity about what WTO reform means or the process by which members would engage in this work on WTO reform. And so we wanted our trade ministers to really commit to this future work program on reform. But importantly, we wanted them to do so through a process that would be transparent, and a process that would be inclusive, and a process that could be designed to address the interests of all WTO members, especially small economies like ours. So that's just a snapshot, Salas, of the many outcomes that we wanted to see as CARICOM, this ministerial conference, deliver.
Chantal, you spoke about food security and what is happening and the spill-off effect of the war in Ukraine. I am wondering, perchance, as someone just filling up their vehicle and realizing that the cost of petrol has doubled or tripled in the last couple of months here in CARICOM, if that aspect as well would have been discussed at all. I am amazed that these things sometimes need to be drilled down to the public, disseminating that the discussion up here can have some sort of effect down here and into your pocket. So I'm asking, in terms of the cost of living, you mentioned about food and the cost of food, but I mean also generally cost of living.
Yes. No, I think the way in which cost of living concerns was probably addressed most frontally at the conference was through the outcomes that were secured in relation to food insecurity.
Okay.
And the rising fuel prices, that's a context for the rising prices. Of course, fuel is an input to the production of many products, including food. And so rising fuel prices would, of course, have a knock-on effect on food production and as a result the cost of food. You can understand as well that with Russia, for instance, being such a major producer of an input like wheat, that the war in Ukraine and the fallout from that could have knock-on effects on inputs that are needed for the production of basic food items. And so food security was a major focus at the conference. And I'm pleased to say that there are two outcomes I want to stress that were generated from the conference that relate to food security. One is there was agreement that WTO members arrived at that if they were to take any emergency food security measures, that they would essentially be constrained. They would ensure that these are minimally trade distortive. They would have to be temporary. They would have to be targeted. And there'd have to be transparency in their use, and they'd have to be notified to the WTO. You can understand that in a context of, possible food shortages, there might be a tendency or there might be a knee-jerk reaction to impose restrictions on exports of food. But you can imagine what the knock-on effect that might have on net food importing developing countries like ours in CARICOM. So I think an important outcome of the conference was this decision that was reached that there would be restraint exercised in the use of export restrictions in emergency situations. And also there was an important decision reached that WTO members would not restrict food exports that are purchased by the World Food Programme for humanitarian purposes.
Okay.
So those were two important outcomes of the conference where food security was concerned.
Perchance, I know that you were there from the Secretariat along, I think, with Ambassador Wayne McCook. Ukraine or Russia were represented?
They both were represented at the conference. And I must say that in the lead up to the conference, there had been fears that the conflict between these two key WTO members might have been very destabilizing to the conference and might have inhibited the ability of WTO members to essentially focus their discussions on the range of subjects on which they wanted to secure deliverables. And there were instances during the conference, in particular a session on the first day dealing with challenges facing the multilateral trading system, where members did have they made very candid statements about the war in Ukraine and the impact that they felt it was having on the multilateral trading system. But I'm pleased to say that all in all, WTO members were able, notwithstanding the backdrop of these geopolitical tensions, to nonetheless focus and engage in meaningful discussions that generated some very positive outcomes.
I'm shaking my head because you have a way with words and the diplomatic language in candid discussion when people are dying and thousands and the military incursion, etc. And you just put it across so nicely.
No, I mean, not to in any way diminish the importance of those geopolitical tensions, but the reality is it was understood that there was an opportunity that members had to take some important decisions that could address some challenges that really affect people the world over. And it's important that the opportunity was seized.
How was the participation of the Caribbean community coordinated at the conference? Was it member states all participating? And you also, I shouldn't do this, but a second question. You said of the 15 members, two are not members. The 15 members of the community, I suspect one would be Montserrat.
Yes.
The other is who?
The other is the Bahamas, and the
Okay.
Bahamas for quite some time has actually been engaged in negotiations to become a WTO member. And so the Bahamas really, even though it's not yet a member of the WTO, um, it actually did observe the discussions at the WTO, just not as a full member. But to go to your question, Salas, about how we participated, how were we coordinated as CARICOM in the conference. I just want to take a step back and just recall that coordination of external trade policy, it's a feature of our economic integration arrangement. And this kind of coordination extends to the way in which we participate in the WTO, and it allows us to collectively have a stronger voice at the multilateral level. So our preparations for this ministerial conference, they were coordinated. So I'm going to talk about how we were coordinated at the conference, but I don't want to diminish all of the important preparatory work that involved coordination as well. So our trade officials, our trade ministers, they deliberated for some time on how we should prepare for the conference. And so going in, our priorities and positions were already settled. And in the lead up to the conference, I have to give a shout out to our Geneva-based diplomats because they ably represented us in negotiations as a CARICOM group and as part of the wider coalition of African, Caribbean, and Pacific states of which our members are a part. Now, at the ministerial conference itself, our coordination was, as you mentioned, supported by the secretariat. At the conference, we had CARICOM ministerial representation from 8 countries, Antigua and Barbados, which served as one of the vice chairs of the conference, Belize, Dominica, Guyana, Jamaica, which also was the coordinator of the ACP group, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Suriname. And other members were represented at ambassadorial level, Grenada, St. Lucia, Trinidad and Tobago. And Guyana serves as CARICOM's lead ministerial spokesperson in the WTO. You know that in our regional arrangement, we often assign particular responsibilities to various countries. And so Guyana is our lead ministerial spokesperson in the WTO. And, Minister Hugh Todd, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation of Guyana, he ably led CARICOM ministerial coordination at MC12. And so Guyana delivered statements on behalf of CARICOM during the conference. Guyana chaired meetings of our CARICOM caucus. And along with Belize at one point, Guyana also represented the community in bilateral and smaller group meetings at the conference, because at a conference like this, all the negotiations don't take place in plenary with all 164 members present. There are many discussions which take place in smaller group formats, and where we were invited to these meetings, our CARICOM ministerial spokesperson from Guyana ably represented the community. I just want to point out as well, Salas, that there was also coordination amongst the members of the OECS, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. And it was really important to note that the coordination amongst the OECS and the CARICOM coordination at the conference, it was mutual, it was complementary, and it was mutually supportive. And so we had coordination taking place at various levels, but I think what it did lead to was our effective engagement in the conference.
Can I ask, Chantel, you have spoken about the community-wide coordination and representation, but you and the other colleague, Ambassador McCook, would have gone. What would have been our input from the Secretariat as well?
Yes, our input was wide-ranging. Our inputs related to, providing support with the preparation of statements that were made in various sessions, including thematic sessions addressing the various subjects that were being dealt with at the conference. We provided support to the CARICOM caucus. And so with respect to the convening of those meetings, with respect to providing advice to support those meetings, even in some cases having to respond in real time to issues which needed to be resolved that arose during the conference, providing advice to member states so that they could, in consultations with capitals, determine what positions they might need to take on particular issues. We also, at one point, actually participated in negotiations representing the ACP group, the
Okay.
fisheries subsidies negotiations, which really went down to the wire. You mentioned that the conference was actually extended by 2 days. Those negotiations literally ran until dawn of on the final day. And as part of the secretariat team, we were involved in those negotiations.
Glad to hear. Glad to hear. As we wrap up, maybe one or two more questions, of course, looking at the outcomes of the conference, and also, would you say, and I think you may have mentioned it throughout the interview, our expectations, would you say they were met, and where do we go from here? The follow-up from MC12, are we going to see an MC13, MC14, and not 5 years down the road?
Yes, I'm going to answer your first question. In a nutshell, I would say most of our expectations were met. A decision was adopted on the work program on small economies, and so thankfully that work on small economies, which is of such importance to our countries, will continue. An agreement was concluded on fisheries subsidies. I must say it was more limited in ambition than what we wanted, but it is significant. It is an agreement that prohibits subsidies to illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. It also prohibits subsidies to the fishing of overfished stocks. And it prohibits subsidies to unregulated fishing on the high seas. What is it that we didn't get? We wanted the agreement to go further and be comprehensive in scope and also discipline subsidies that are provided, subsidies that contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. And these subsidies actually represent the lion's share of global fisheries subsidies. What was important, and I'm pleased to say that CARICOM was instrumental to this particular aspect of the negotiations. What was instead secured was an agreement to continue the negotiations towards that comprehensive agreement. And to incentivize these negotiations, what WTO members actually agreed to was that if they don't adopt that comprehensive agreement within 4 years of this limited agreement entering into force, that agreement is going to automatically terminate. And so to answer your second question about what is to come, where fisheries subsidies is concerned, the work is by no means done. There are additional negotiations that will be taking place, and we must be positioned to continue to contribute meaningfully to those discussions. In terms of the pandemic response, there was a very important decision reached that eligible WTO members, and that covers most developing members, those most developing country members, they could actually override COVID-19 vaccine patents for the production and supply of COVID-19 vaccines up to the year 2027. And it was also decided that in 6 months' time, members have to come back to take a decision on whether they're going to extend this waiver to therapeutics and to diagnostics. As you know, Salas, many of us, we don't have the domestic manufacturing capacity to produce vaccines, therapeutics, or diagnostics. But what we were keen to do was ensure that any vaccines that were produced under this waiver, but which we may actually patent in our countries, we could import them freely and quickly, and if necessary, we could re-export them to other partners within the region. And we are satisfied that this decision facilitates our ability to take such measures. The pandemic response wasn't just limited to this intellectual property response. It was also recognizing that there are other areas in which we need to be prepared for future pandemics. It was recognized that we have to restrain our use of export restrictions. During the pandemic, these kinds of export restrictions hampered the ability of our countries to get the supplies that they actually needed. It was recognized that travel restrictions have a negative impact on tourism. Many of us are tourism dependent economies. And so it was important that the WTO members recognized that they needed to engage in dialogue on how to mitigate the impact of travel restrictions. In the area of agriculture and food security, I would have already mentioned what the outcomes were with respect to trade and food security. I would just add that this was one disappointment for us. There was no agreement on a future work program on agriculture negotiations. Um, it's really an area where there are a lot of divisions amongst the membership. Those divisions were not able to be overcome. And so the negotiations are going to continue, but not necessarily based on new guidance that trade ministers would have been able to issue. I would have mentioned we wanted to see an outcome on WTO reform. This was secured. There's an agreement to work towards WTO reform, just as we wanted, based on an inclusive process, an open process. And importantly, there was a commitment to work towards having a well-functioning dispute settlement system that all members can access by 2024. So, you know,
That WTO reform, I
yes.
go on with that. What was agreed to, did it mean more involvement of our little states in the
I think
process and guiding the process?
I would want to say this. The WTO as it stands is a unique multilateral organization for us because it's a multilateral organization operating in the sphere of economic affairs in which we actually have a vote, a say, a voice as small countries on an equal footing. That's already the status quo. What we would want to see through WTO reform is that foundational premise of the WTO is preserved, and in essence, it's actually strengthened. So we would want to see that any efforts made to improve the functioning of the WTO allows countries like ours, small countries like ours, to continue to have an equal say in matters that affect not only our interests, but the interests of the membership as a whole. So I just wanted to contextualize that we do have in the current arrangement, I think, a significant voice. What we don't want is any kind of reform that would lead to the silencing of that voice or that voice being diminished. So we would want to see improvements to the negotiating function, improvements to the dispute settlement function that ensure that the interests of our countries as small members continue to have equal consideration.
I don't want to make this an engagement on the WTO, but there are a couple more questions I have that I could ask, especially in that vein, but another time. Another
Okay.
time for
I
that.
look forward to that discussion.
Because there are so many um, comments, especially, for example, with the one that has been long running, Antigua and the
Yes,
United States, and
yes,
this larger country, and Antigua and Barbuda not wanting to disrupt nice diplomatic relationships by
yes.
taking certain steps that they have been advised to. So I would leave it at that. I would leave it at that for now, Chantal. And
The,
I would like to, sorry, go
no,
ahead.
the one thing I would just say, Salas, is that you're hitting on a very important issue for us, which underscores the need for us to be fully engaged in these discussions on reform, including with respect to the dispute settlement mechanism of the WTO, to ensure that we do have a mechanism that can be truly accessible and of utility to all WTO members, including the smallest. I just wanted to signal our continuing interest in that issue.
Thanks ever so much, Chantal. I've been having a nice chat, office chat, just that we're in same space, but she's in her office and I'm in my office. And I want to thank the colleagues at headquarters, CARICOM Secretariat headquarters, Kendall Morgan and Shudesh, who have produced this and put it all together so we can reflect and speak about the work of the community. And we, as the community's public servants, when we go and make representation on their behalf, we can come back and state what are some of the outcomes. And I would like to thank Chantal, my colleague. She is the trade policy and legal specialist at the CARICOM Secretariat. And I will follow up on another discussion, Chantal, on some other areas for another time. You take care, and thanks again.
Thanks, Alice, and I look forward to that future discussion.